still got 2 minutes. We're going to be in 21. All right. Only 100, those are mine. Only 100, those are me. Well, it's 6. Go ahead and start. I can lead us in prayer. Dear Lord, I thank you for the opportunity for us to come together and to study your word. I pray that this will be edifying and used for your glory. In your son's name I pray, amen. All right, you ready to start? So we are going to continue in our study of 1 Samuel. And we are now well into the story or tragedy of King Saul. Last time, we talked about kind of the culmination of Saul's descent into madness. It seems like this has come full circle, and now he's just completely off his rocker. And we even talked about kind of stories about characters that have defied God in some way, which has resulted in their continuing or culmination in madness. And I made a mention of this, but the more I thought about it and the more I looked into it, the more I like it. And I think we can divide Saul's reign into sort of 3 phases or periods. You have the early part of his reign, which goes from about 1 Samuel 9 through chapter 14, which is fairly positive for the most part. Yes, he's disobedient, which results in him losing the covenant, or losing out on the covenant. But his sort of assessment at the end of chapter 14 is surprisingly positive despite his disobedience. Then we have the middle part of his reign where he is now kind of more flagrantly in disobedience, and we're seeing the blessing of God leave him, and he is slowly descending into madness. And now we're at the final part of his reign, and that's kind of where we're starting today, where he's just completely off his rocker, and it's just going to keep getting worse until his eventual demise. So we're in kind of the final phase of Saul, which goes from chapter 20 through chapter 31. So today we're going to be in chapter 20 and 21. So this is David officially on the run from Saul. Now, there's a couple of things we're going to talk about before we can really appreciate what's going on in this story. And the first off I'll talk about is the concept of morality, because as I was going through commentaries and looking at lessons, it seems like chapters 20 and 21 are very difficult to go through and teach. And I think mainly it has to do with our understanding of David. So we're talking about morality, right? It's very common to think of or to describe early perception of morality in terms of black and white. And we even call people like this naive, right? To think that the world is that simplistic. There's good, there's evil, right and wrong, and that's all there is. One of my favorite series of movies, is the original Star Wars trilogy. And in the first film, Luke Skywalker wears white because it's supposed to symbolize his naivety, it's supposed to symbolize his innocence. And then we get to the second film, right? And this is supposed to symbolize that as you get older, you realize the world isn't that simple, right? There's gray. And to even talk about it in concepts of white and black is inaccurate because everything can be seen from different perspectives, and things are just more complicated than they initially appear. And this is symbolized by Luke wearing gray or dark tan, right? He's no longer wearing the white because he is now aged, he's matured, and he understands the world isn't as simple as it was in the early stages. And this culminates in his appearance in Return of the Jedi, where he now wears black, as if to symbolize that there's almost good in black, that there's good and evil, and that he needs to embrace that side of himself. However, I'm going to argue that the world really is black and white, and that this is kind of the final phase of understanding, and that many people don't even get to this point, and realizing that the world is that simple. I think the Bible presents it that way. And this is beautifully culminated in Luke, where at the very end of the film, his shirt's torn open, and you see that the inside of his tunic is actually white. This is after Darth Vader has been redeemed, as if to show that Luke has always been white, that has never left him, that innocence has never left him. We used to make really good films with really good morals and stories. So Luke revealing that he's always had that white within him and that he has never lost his sort of innocence is quite symbolic, right? Then the next thing we need to talk about, so the issue here is we're talking about David now on the run. And part of what makes these series of chapters difficult is it's easy to think of stories in terms of very simplistic narrative progression. That is, there's a hero who wants to defeat the villain, and there are individuals or forces in his way that stop him. The problem here is we now have two figures that are at odds with each other that are both anointed by God. So David, of course, is anointed, and we like David. Yeah, David's great, right? And then there's Saul, who's going to be the antagonist. And yet Saul is also anointed by God. In fact, I think this is really the only time in Scripture we have two people both anointed by God that are trying to kill each other. And you can go, well, but Saul's the bad guy. Saul's evil. Saul's off his rocker, and so on. That doesn't change the fact that he's still anointed. That doesn't change the fact that he is still a messianic figure, whether you like it or not. I think honestly, I've always thought that the high point of David's righteousness is when he has a chance to kill Saul and he doesn't. We're going to get to that eventually. And when he's asked, why didn't you do that? His answer is because he's a Messiah, and you don't kill the Messiah. I think this is the high point of David's righteousness, which also, well, we'll get to that. So we have an issue here where we have a story with essentially two, I'm going to call them heroes, but the heroes are in conflict with each other. The heroes are clashing with each other. This is something we do see in stories, but it's fairly rare, and it's rarely done well. So Black Panther, this probably doesn't mean anything to you. That's fine. Naruto is a kids' TV show, but it does this very well. Probably the most famous story, however, is the story of Troy, the Iliad, where you have this famous war, and within the war you have this internal conflict between two heroes, Achilles and Hector, neither of which are the villain. Right? Neither of them are the reason for the war, and yet they're at odds with each other. They want to kill each other. And the entire story of the Iliad culminates in their conflict, even though, again, they have no real reason to kill each other. They have no reason to hate each other other than the fact that Hector mistakenly killed Patroclus, but that was an accident. And yet, so we have two figures who are both heroes within their own story, and yet they are now in conflict. Not too dissimilar to what we have with David and Saul, right? They are both heroes, they're both anointed by God, and yet their stories are now in conflict. And this also brings us to the issue of description versus prescription. So in description, right, that's where something is described. It doesn't necessarily mean it is endorsed or something that you're supposed to do. Whereas a prescription is what doctors do. They write on their little pad and they tell you to do this. This is what you need to do to stay healthy and whatnot. So this is an issue with the Bible. When we read something in the Bible, is it a description of what happened, or is it a prescription of how you should act? And we get into these kinds of stories like in Samuel 20 and 21, and the issue is what we're reading an example of how we should behave, or is this simply a description of events that have happened, whether or not the actors are behaving right or wrong? This also gets into the issue I've already brought up of virtue ethics. This is a mistake. We shouldn't do this, so don't do it. And the virtue ethics, and simply put, is where you associate the individual with right behavior. So just because someone does something, it is therefore right because the person did it. The contrast that I used is Barack Obama and Donald Trump. So in some circles, I've heard people say Trump is wrong to use drone strikes. But then they'll say Barack Obama was right to use drone strikes. And then vice versa. Barack Obama was wrong to use drone strikes and Trump was right to use them. It doesn't matter who did it. Either they're right or wrong, right? Whether or not the Republican did it or a Democrat did it shouldn't justify the action. Either they were right to happen or they were wrong to happen, right? It shouldn't matter who signed off on them. But our political spectrum is very polarized right now, and we tend to fall into this category of justifying the person rather than the act itself. One of the greatest treatises on this is Fear and Trembling by Kierkegaard, where he's writing about whether or not Abraham was justified in sacrificing Isaac. At what point, because we say in the Bible that he was righteous in doing it, at what exactly made it a righteous act? So one of the issues is, was it because Abraham himself was virtuous? Virtue ethics? And his answer is no, of course not. You can't say that, because then you could say if Abraham walked across the street and murdered a puppy, or murdered some other kid, you have to say he was righteous because he's righteous as an individual. So there's something outside of Abraham, outside of the actor, that makes the thing right or wrong. So we've got a lot going on in this story, and we had to cover all of it. So the concept of morality, the concept of multiple heroes within a story, the idea that virtue comes from outside of a person rather than inside, and that just because an event is described doesn't mean it's prescribed. I know that's a lot to take in, but these couple of chapters are going to be quite interesting. So, again, we are in chapter 20 and 21, and we're talking about David now on the run from King Saul. So it begins in verse 1. David fled from Naioth and Ramah and came to Jonathan and asked, "What have I done? What did I do wrong? How have I sinned against your father so that he wants to take my life?" So we know that Saul has already tried to kill David twice. David is now running around trying to get away from Saul. He ran to Ramah looking for Samuel, and Samuel told him to hide out in Naioth, which seems to be some sort of settlement outside the city. And so now he's coming to Jonathan to ask for help. So in verse 2, Jonathan said to him, "No, you won't die. Listen, my father doesn't do anything great or small without telling me, so why would he hide this matter from me? This can't be true." So Jonathan either is unaware or in complete denial that his father's gone crazy, and he doesn't want to believe that his father is actually trying to kill David. This seems too fantastical, right? Just too out of the norm. So he's refusing to believe David, right? So in verse 3, "But David said, 'Your father certainly knows that you have come to look favorably on me. He has said, Jonathan must not know of this, or else he will be grieved.' David also swore, 'As surely as the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, there is a step between me and death.'" So David's doubling down. Yes, your father wants to kill me. I'm on the run because of it, and if he finds me, he's going to catch me, right, and going to kill me. So in verse 4, Jonathan said to David, "Whatever you say, I will do for you." So David told him, "Look, tomorrow is the new moon, and I'm supposed to sit down and eat with the king. Instead, let me go, and I'll hide in the field until the third night. If your father misses me at all, say, 'David urgently requested my permission to go quickly to this town, Bethlehem, for an annual sacrifice, there involving the whole clan.' If he says good, then your servant is safe. But if he becomes angry, you will know he has evil intentions. Deal faithfully with your servant, for you have brought me into a covenant with you before the Lord. If I've done anything wrong, then kill me yourself. Why take me to your father?" So there's a couple of things here, right? Jonathan is asking, he doesn't want to believe that his father really wants to kill David. So he's like, how can we resolve this? So David says, look, there's some big feast that's coming up. We're going to learn a little bit more about it in a second. Because I'm supposed to be there. I'm not going to show up. And you're going to observe how Saul acts, right? And if he seems genuinely concerned about me, then you can